This young, apparently fit young man with everything to live for is handed a drink at a wedding and then falls to the floor in a fit of convulsions and dies.
Yeah, dodgy point.
It is more than a bit suspicious, isn't it?
The year 1066 is the most famous date in English history, when William of Normandy defeated Harold II of England and won himself a crown and the epithet, the Conqueror. But there is a lot more to it than just one bloody battle at Hastings. You'll find half a century of invasion and political manoeuvring before it, and decades of brutal subjugation afterwards. Medieval historian Marc Morris is an expert in the subject. His books include The Norman Conquest and The Anglo-Saxons, and in this 4-part podcast series he talks to me, David Musgrove, about the full story of the Norman Conquest. So welcome to 1066, the battle for England. This is episode 1, Vikings, Normans and rebellious Anglo-Saxons, the run-up to 1066. Mark, I think we should start 50 years before 1066 in 1016, and that's not just because that's a nice round half-century, but rather because that was quite a lively year as well. Can you take us back to 1016, give us a little sense about what was happening in that year?
Yes, well, 1016, as you've suggested, was a tumultuous year because there was an earlier conquest. People often say it's a forgotten conquest. I think it's just overshadowed by the scale of 1066, the Norman conquest. 1016 was when King Cnut took over. He would shortly become King of Denmark, and he was Danish, so we can call it the Danish conquest, if you like. And that came at the end of a very long period of Viking/Danish raids on England that had begun in the 980s. So, a good generation or two before. And like earlier Viking raids, they'd started off as a pain but not an existential threat. And by the start of the 11th century, people were starting to realise that this actually was very, very, very serious. These raids coincided with the long reign of the famous Æthelred the Unready, or Æthelred Unready, the ill-counselled king, to translate his name properly. And they culminated with a series of invasions in the 1010s, which resulted in a conquest as early as 1014. Cnut's father, Svein Forkbeard, was king. He displaced Æthelred the Unready, but only for about 5 minutes. He was king, and then he died suddenly, giving Æthelred this chance at a comeback, which he completely fluffed. He was king, sort of sworn back in and made to promise to be better in future, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but behaved just as bad as he did in the past. And then Cnut turns up in 1015, and by 1016, Æthelred has died. In the spring, and he is briefly succeeded by his much more mettlesome son, Edmund Ironside, who fights a number of successful battles against the Danes, but then loses the last one at Assendon, which permits Cnut to take over. So that's a long way of saying we have a Viking king of England takes over in the winter of 1016.
And there's quite a few sudden deaths in this story, aren't there? People do seem to die quite quickly after taking power quite often. Is that curious?
Well, I don't think it's particularly curious in the case of Svein Forkbeard, because he must have been, well into middle age by our standards, which is quite a good innings for the standards of the 11th century for medieval warriors. There are cases throughout sort of Old English history where you suddenly find, and in this period as well, into the Norman period, where you find quite young men coming to power, and then suddenly after a month or so dropping dead, which strikes me as much more suspicious. And there are cases in Anglo-Saxon history where, in the case of someone like Edward the Martyr, it was uncover-upable, if you see what I mean, that he was deliberately done to death. But there are other people, you think, isn't that convenient? He dropped dead right in the middle of a succession dispute, resolving everything very tidily. So yes, it does go on.
Yeah. So we've had Æthelred the Unready and Edmund Ironside. They're both out of the picture. Cnut, the Viking, is on the throne. It's the year 1016, and Cnut reigns until 1035. And we should say, so he's on the throne of England, and perhaps we will discuss in this podcast a little bit about what that England means in this context. But before we do that, Cnut? What was he like, and what was his reign like?
Well, the traditional picture of Cnut is that he was very, very successful. And I don't think you can doubt in terms of the way he kind of ruled England with an iron fist that he was, a successful ruler in that regard. The problem with Cnut is that I mentioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle earlier, which is probably the primary source for this period. Whilst it's been very loquacious in the last years of Æthelred the Unready, laying into the king and his advisors and condemning them for all eternity, when it gets to Cnut, it more or less, shuts up entirely. You can look at the entire. You said Cnut reigned for nearly 20 years, 19 years. The entirety of his reign is a double page opening in the modern edition of print, and it's only a few lines. This year the king, went to Denmark. This year the king went somewhere else. So it's very, very, very terse. So the politics of his reign are to some extent almost unrecoverable. We can see that he did a very good job on the church, or the church cozied up to him fairly quickly. So it was portrayed as a sort of model ruler, model Christian king. There's a good letter to him, I forget from which continental bishop, saying, thank you for these amazing gifts you sent us. And we had heard you were a pagan prince, but now we see what a good son of the church you are. You're an amazing Christian ruler. So he had good PR, Cnut, and I think that did him very well, even down to the sort of the start of the 21st century. Latterly, scholars have pointed more recherche sources, like the skaldic poets writing at his court, saying that for all his success, it's founded on bloodshed and violence, and these celebrated kind of the triumph of Scandinavian arms over the English. And so it must have been for the English that survived this takeover very, very difficult to try and negotiate this new world where they were being ruled over by Danes celebrating their success, and difficult for the church as well, because they are although that Cnut is ostensibly a Christian and his followers may well subscribe to that, they are fairly new to the party. And you can see people like Wulfstan, the Bishop of Worcester, sort of struggling with what's going on in this new Scandinavian-ruled realm, according to sort of Scandinavian standards, to do with things like, the export of slaves to Scandinavia and that sort of thing. So it's as I say, a challenging time for the English elite.
Yeah, and on his Christianity, fun Cnut fact. He was actually called Lambert.
Well, that apparently was his baptismal name.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but I've never seen, apart from that one source that says that, I've never seen anyone referring to him as King Lambert. So I think we'll stick with Cnut for the purposes of this podcast, at least.
That's a shame, because that would have been quite good fun. Okay, so you talked about that just a little bit, but what happened to the English nobility, the existing English nobility, while Cnut and his sons reigned? And we'll talk about his sons in a bit, but.
Well, they suffered enormously in the run-up to the start of Cnut's reign, because, and we might come on to this, but the Scandinavians, in contrast to the Normans when they come later, they just don't take prisoners. So lots of the English nobility in fighting the Vikings, resisting the Vikings in the generation before that, had perished, or they had been mutilated. There's a famous instance where Cnut, when Æthelred comes back and the English turn against Cnut, and he sort of has to leave and go back to Scandinavia, he retaliates by mutilating the English hostages he's been given. So there must have been lots of sort of English heirs who either put out of action or who inherited, but they didn't have ears or noses, or they lost an eye, lost a limb as a result of the Viking takeover. And that bloodletting continues certainly for the first couple of years of Cnut's reign, as he fairly ruthlessly eliminates any threats to his position. So you mentioned, or I mentioned, Æthelred the Unready and his son Edmund Ironside. But Edmund Ironside had several other brothers. He has 5 other brothers by Æthelred's first queen, and 2 other half-brothers who we'll come on to. But we don't want for potential challengers to Cnut, so he rubs them out. If they haven't already died in battle, there's certainly one who's deliberately done in. And that goes for the rest of the English nobility as well. You know, those people Cnut deems a threat are fairly ruthlessly eliminated. I mean, there's one chap who doesn't deserve much sympathy called Æthelred the Grabber, who'd been a source of sort of political instability during Æthelred the Unready's reign. And had changed sides repeatedly in the last year or so, switching to the Vikings and switching back, and then finally siding with Cnut. And Cnut, I think, just sees right through him, and after a couple of months, he is, eliminated. So, not good. Not, as I say, not a good time to be an English aristocrat. And those that do manage to flourish during this period do so by having to not just make their peace with the fact that a large portion of the new elite is now Scandinavian, but actively kind of buying into that. And you can see where I'm going with this. The most obvious example is Earl Godwin. Godwin, who was sufficiently obscure. He wasn't like a scrubbed up peasant, but he's sufficiently obscure that we can't say for certain who his father was. So he's probably from a powerful sort of Sussex Thanley family, but we can't say any more than that. Very soon into Cnut's reign, he is promoted to be Earl of Wessex, which basically means he's occupying the place of the old kings of Wessex. He's governing all of sort of southern England, south of the Thames, certainly, and he's promoted to the rank of Earl. He's married to Cnut's sister-in-law. So Cnut, for whatever reason, Cnut takes a real shine to this Englishman who presumably had collaborated with him in the run-up to his reign. It's significant that when Godwin starts to name his sons, his firstborn son is called Harold, which we think of nowadays as a sort of, an English name of long standing, but is in fact a Scandinavian name. So, this is a sign that Godwin is very definitely knows which side his bread is buttered and is kind of, joining in this new Scandinavian ruling class.
Excellent. Right, now, a couple of things. So Æthelred Streona, the Grabbler, he was voted as one of the worst Britons in a BBC History magazine poll many years ago.
That must have been someone like Levi Roach who put him. Yes, I would put him in there, absolutely.
Yeah. A person of limited loyalty.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things that if it was just someone's opinion, the fact that he's got that sobriquet that comes down to us, you'd think, well, there might be this chronicler might have a particular animus against him, but just judged on his actions, the way he's a constant trimmer, and every time things seem to be going badly for one side, he sort of manages to switch sides. So he's the revisionist case for Æthelred Streona has yet to be put. Let's put it that way.
And then, okay, so we just mentioned Godwin there, but let's just quickly go back to the fate of the old English royal house. So you talked about the difficulties that the nobility faced and the sons of Æthelred and Ironside's brothers. Some wise members of that royal family did leave England.
Yes, well, if we're going to move on to the next sort of bit of the family tree now. So Æthelred had been married not once but twice. His first wife, Elthgifu, we know hardly anything about, but his second wife, he was married in 1002 to Emma, who was the sister of the Duke of Normandy. And becomes a very important character in the next 50 years of English history. And she has, or rather Æthelred and Emma, have two more sons together, Edward, later the Confessor, and Alfred, and also a daughter called Godyifu, if memory serves. And these are this new family, this younger family of Æthelred's. Yes, they get out before the bloodletting starts. So at some point before the end of Æthelred's reign, they hop across the channel. And of course, that's the convenient thing in the case of Emma, is she has that bolt hole because she's from Normandy. So she has kin across the other side of the channel that will receive her and her children.
Yep. And then also, we won't dwell on this now, but there were a son of Edmund Ironside who also leaves the country. Or is sent out of the country. We're sort of like straying into sort of like myth and legend, but certainly is a real person and certainly comes back, but not for
not for half a century or so.
No, but we'll come back to it. We'll
Yeah.
just leave that thought there. Emma of Normandy, she's an interesting woman, isn't she? You mentioned that she's sort of on the scene for quite a long time from here, and she's married to two kings.
Which I believe makes her unique.
Mm-hmm.
That no other queen has been married to two consecutive kings, or even two non-consecutive kings.
No. So it's quite something, and she must have had some interesting personal characteristics, one would imagine.
Well, certainly. I mean, yes. I mean, it has to be said from the start that the reason we're so well informed about Emma is she wrote a tract, or commissioned a tract to be written, I should say, in the late 1030s, defending her role in the very messy and bloody politics that were sort of going on at the time. And so, she comes across as a power player, and I think she was, but she comes out of this very, very well because it's written at her behest by a paid pen. And so that's the thing you have to bear in mind when people say, oh, she was terribly strong, wasn't she? She was terribly powerful. It's like, yes, but, we get a very one-sided view of her, entirely to her advantage. The thing that's interesting at the start of her marriage to Cnut is where the initiative lay, because she, as you can imagine, gives the impression that Cnut just was head over heels in love with her and, more or less, wooed her, and she kind of graciously agreed to be married to him. Whereas the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written closer to the time, says Cnut caused the widow of Æthelred to be fetched as his queen, suggesting that she had a lot less say in the matter. And then it may just have been Cnut's idea to say, well, look, my rule rests on nothing other than violence. What better way to legitimize it than to marry the widow of the former king? If nothing else, she will be a helpmeet, a translator, a way to kind of smooth ruffled feathers, a way to sort of me to negotiate the politics. She'll know how to do that. So that, I think, where the initiative lay is kind of up for debate. But it's certainly seems that I'm disinclined to believe most of what we're told in the tract commissioned by Emma, because so much of it is demonstrably lies.
Well, that's interesting. Maybe a moment for pause here, just for a second, because there's the sources there, as you described, two quite different views on a particular topic. As a historian, dealing with quite limited sources in most of these topics, how do you decide on which one is most likely to be correct?
Well, in the case of, I think I always have the most fun with the things that are clearly propaganda. So the starting point should be it's all propaganda. Nobody sits down to write anything in a sense of kind of like, I'm going to just dispassionately record this in my diary.
Yep.
If they're writing it for any kind of readership, then they're trying to put across a point of view. But some are more propagandist than others. So, and there are a lot of them in this story of the Norman Conquest. So we one of the early ones is the encomium of Queen Emma. And then we get later ones like William of Poitiers, who's writing a biography of William the Conqueror, basically to justify the Norman Conquest. And when these people, when such writers, really get going, they are trying to convince you that sort of black is white, or that William the Conqueror was just the most feared warrior in France when he's 15 years old, or that Queen Emma absolutely had no hand in the death of her son, and they absolutely go to town. They go for pages and pages and pages to convince you, that something that might seem really obvious isn't the case. And so as propaganda goes, they are not subtle. And so when I have sources like that, just to take a random example that's not from this period, but in the Anglo-Saxons book, I was talking about Bishop Wilfrid of Northumbria. And just in the middle of his biography, it says, how sober he was, how he never had more than half a glass of wine at dinner. And very many people will attest to this. Yeah. And you think, as a reader, you go, why are we talking about Wilfrid's alcoholism? And you think when people start saying other people will tell you this, you think, okay, you are answering clearly a chorus of contemporary opinion that says Wilfrid was forever on the sauce, or Emma was the woman chiefly responsible for the death of her younger son, or William the Conqueror actually wasn't as nice as you might think.
Yeah.
So it's in the case of these very propagandist texts, they almost kind of condemn themselves out of their own mouths by their insistence on the what is likely to be the opposite of the truth. And then especially if you have another source which seems to be just more straightforward, like it's one sentence, this year this happened.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be giving you such a hard sell, then you kind of say, well, that's one of the contrary voices. Now, who do you believe? Well, I'm probably more inclined to go this way. So it's not always, clearly it's not an exact science.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, these very, very trenchant voices are easy to kind of, read against the grain.
Yeah. Excellent. Interesting diversion. Let's step back into the story. So we need to think about Normandy just for a second during the reign of Cnut. While Cnut was on the throne in England, what was happening in Normandy? So we've got Duke Robert I of Normandy is on the throne. We've got Edward and Alfred, the young exiles, living there. What's going on? And is there any truth in the idea that Duke Robert of Normandy tried to invade England on the behalf of those two boys in the 1030s?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, perhaps we should just step back a little further and just talk about very briefly what Normandy was, because, we haven't talked about what England was, but England is roughly the same size in the early 11th century as it is now in terms of its borders. Normandy is, again, similar size to the modern area that is Normandy, but it had come about as a result of Viking invasions. So the Normans were so called by their neighbours because they were the men from the north, the Normandy. And so Normandy is a Viking colony, and people will argue till the cows come home about just how many Normans settled there, because by the time we're talking about now, say the 1030s, where we're up to, the descendants of the people who'd settled 100 years earlier as Vikings had adopted the local culture. So they think of themselves as being French. They say that in their sources, and they do Frankish things. They have converted to Christianity. They call their sons and daughters Christian names, Frankish names. They build castles, they ride horses. They don't seem to have a whole lot of ships left over from their Viking forefathers' days when they come to invade England. So they have sort of, in a sense, I was going to say more French than the French. That's not the case, but they've certainly become as French as the French. The French never let them forget that they are sort of scrubbed up Vikings. There's that constant sense in the other chronicles of like, oh well, that's Normans for you. But they have adopted with relish all the hallmarks of kind of Frankish culture. But back to the politics. Yes, so we've got Duke Robert, who is in power in the early 1030s, and I think for a long time there was a sensation of, oh, can we believe these later stories of him sponsoring invasions by Edward the Confessor and his younger brother Alfred? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, this was proved way back when, at least 40 years ago, by Simon Keynes, looking at the charters, which show, which make passing reference to these events, and show Edward, certainly, as in the witnesses to ducal charters, being styled Rex, king. So he is presenting and being accepted as a sort of king in exile, waiting to go back. So yeah, I think it's entirely plausible that that's what was going on.
Okay, let's charge on a bit. So Cnut dies 1035, succeeded by, he's got two sons who then succeed him. So Harold the First Harefoot from 1035 to 1040, and then half of Cnut 1040 to 1042. And then, surprisingly, Edward, this chap who we've just been talking about, who's been in Normandy, limited power, presumably as an exile, comes back to the throne. How on earth does that happen? Well,
it's a very good question, and this is one of those occasions where we wish we had more source material, because those two reigns of Cnut's sons are clearly very important, and we don't have a lot of information. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is incredibly terse, especially for the reign of Harold I. And I think it was because what happened in that period was that both Edward and his younger brother Alfred tried to stage a comeback after Cnut's death. All bets are off. It's kind of, is it going to, which of his sons will succeed? And there are competing factions clearly, and competing queen mothers who are very keen for their offspring to succeed rather than the other queens. So, one good example. I'm going slightly backwards now, but one good example of how Cnut sort of ostensibly embraced Christianity, but only up to a point, was that he seems to have had two queens on the go at one time. Never sort of fully put away his first wife, Elfgifu of Northampton. So he has this complicated problem when he dies, is that he has sons with different women. And Harold succeeds in the first instance because his half-brother, Harthacnut, is absent in Scandinavia. But also I think there's a strong feeling of, and this is something we might touch on with other rulers, is that Harold is the English candidate. Harold is born of a marriage of Cnut with an Englishwoman from the Midlands. And there's a sense of, well, he's one of us. Whereas Harthacnut is not only in Scandinavia, but he's half Norman, half Scandinavian. So he's got nothing sort of no sort of connection to the native aristocracy. And so he's clearly preferred in the first instance. Then he dies. We don't know, after a 5-year reign. We don't know, whether this is. They're both very young men, both probably in the early 20s are the oldest.
Yep.
And then Harthacnut is puts himself into that position, and is clearly hugely, hugely unpopular.
He's quite big on tax, wasn't he?
He's big on tax. He's big on sending his heavies into areas to lay waste to them if they. I mean, to be fair, the people of Worcester, they did kill Harthacnut's tax assessors or tax collectors, but even so, he responds by harrying Worcestershire. And he's also, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has it in for him on 3 counts. He's a harrier of his own people. He taxes very highly, and he's a breaker of his oath. Ooh. And I think there's a suggestion that one of his rivals comes to court clearly under safe conduct and is done in. So he behaves in a very violent, very Viking way, and the extraordinary thing is, not only does Edward the Confessor succeed him in 1042, Edward the Confessor is invited back midway through Harthacnut's reign to share in his kingship. Now I can't think of a precedent for that. It's like so, and this is the context in which that tract I mentioned about the in praise of Queen Emma is commissioned, because it's sort of, this bit is tagged on the end that says, and thus the 3 of them, Emma and her sons, are sharing power, and with no disagreement between them. Literally, it's very words, no disagreement between them. And you're reading it thinking, really? Because it sounds like you're actually adding this, and people are saying, this is absolutely falling to pieces. These guys clearly hate each other. And then all of a sudden, Harthacnut goes to a wedding feast, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says, at Lambeth in South London in 1042, and dies as he stands at his drink. So there's a nice evocative image there of this young, apparently fit young man with everything to live for, is handed a drink at a wedding and then falls to the floor in a fit of convulsions and dies.
Yeah, dodgy point.
It is more than a bit suspicious, isn't it? And so that's the long-winded version of how we end up with Edward the Confessor. But the politics behind all of this is we have 2 unpopular half Scandinavian kings, and this exile who comes back, who is one of the last remaining, if not the last remaining, representatives of the dynasty that goes all the way back to Alfred and beyond.
Yeah. So
there's a strong sense in which kind of, in terms of his lineage, this is the most legitimate person to rule.
Yeah. We'll talk a bit more about lineage, I'm sure, as we go on, and we'll probably talk about oath breaking a bit, because that comes into the story a bit later on. So Edward the Confessor, he's on the throne, 1042. Everything's good. The old dynasty is restored. How does he feel about the chap you were just talking about, Godwin?
Well, yes, that's the question, isn't it? Now, Godwin is the most powerful man in England, bar none. After the king. He's clearly the man who is the kingmaker, because he's involved in all these negotiations to bring Edward the Confessor back from his Norman exile. So you might think, huge debt of gratitude, thank you very much, but the problem from Edward the Confessor's point of view is that Godwin, in the earlier machinations for power in the 1030s, was the man chiefly responsible for the horrible murder of Edward's younger brother, Alfred. So the question of how well they get on for the next decade depends very much on how quickly you think, if at all, a man is likely to forgive another man for the murder of his brother.
Now just a second.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder about that. Do you think there's any chance that Edward might have been not that bothered about his brother's death? Because as we've seen through this story, it's quite handy to get rid of brothers sometimes because they might be, jockeying for your throne.
Yes, but I don't. We come on to source material, and the main source material for Edward the Confessor's reign is a thing that nowadays goes by, and for a long time has gone by the title "The Life of King Edward Who Rests at Westminster," i.e., the life of Edward the Confessor. But it was begun clearly as a tract in praise of the Godwin family. It starts off with Godwin, and it starts off with Cnut and all the stuff I mentioned about how Godwin cozies up to Cnut and becomes like the father of his nation. That's the kind of the way he's portrayed in that, as just this. He is England personified, and he, just this wonderful guy. It's a very pro-Godwin tract. Bearing that in mind, it's extraordinary that when, as we see later on, when these two men, when the gloves come off and they do fall out very violently, that it includes the allegation that Edward says to him, you can have peace when I get my brother back. Now, it strikes me that would be the kind of thing that would be very easy to go in a just stum in a pæan of praise to the Godwin family. And clearly this was so at the heart of it that even that propagandist couldn't conceal that this was the root of the quarrel. And so I kind of see Edward in 1042, who has, as you say, very few contacts in England. He's been in exile for a quarter of a century. Yeah. I see him as making this Faustian pact, as saying, well, they want me back. This is my birthright. It's what I've been wanting for these past 25 years. I'll have to deal with this guy further down the line. But in the meantime, they appear to bury the hatchet. But I just think Godwin's attitude. I think in Godwin's attitude was like that bit in Monty Python. When Michael Palin says, "Let's not bicker and argue about who killed who." That's, you have to kind of take that line to imagine that they were really actually fast friends. Yeah, I don't think Edward ever put it behind him, the fact that Godwin had contrived the death of his younger brother. Yeah.
Okay. So on that basis, then, do you think King Edward chose to marry Edith of the Godwin family?
I don't think he had much choice. Again, to go back to that tract, The Life of King Edward, which is entirely pro-Godwin, it's to big up the Godwins and say how great they are. It says, it gives and it's commissioned by Edith. So it's commissioned by Edward's queen. And so it goes to town in a description of her that's at least half a page long, saying how beautiful she was, how accomplished she was. She could speak multiple languages. She was a wonderful embroiderer, embroideress. And having trotted out all these accomplishments and saying why she was just such a catch for the new king, it says, and more to the point, Edward knew that his grip on power, his grasp of his kingdom, would be all the more all secure because she was a Godwin. So, it's saying the quiet part loud there at the end by saying the implication is if he hadn't married her, then who's to say that, he wouldn't have had something poured in his drink at the next Lambeth wedding, So I think, this is just my reading of very heavily propagandist tracts, as I'm always disinclined to believe something if it says, and you have to believe this because I'm telling you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Edward's married to Edith, daughter of Godwin, and there's this interesting dynamic between the two families. Let's skip on to the 1050s when there is a falling out.
Yeah.
What happens?
Well, I mean, one of the things we should say briefly is that as well as marrying Godwin's daughter, Edith, he also promotes Godwin's sons, the Godwinsons, as we will refer to them.
Yep.
And so we have the black sheep of the family, the eldest son, Sweyn, who's promoted to an earldom. Harold, who will eventually become king in 1066, he is promoted to an earldom. And a cousin of theirs is also promoted to an earldom. So clearly, either Edward the Confessor is looking around saying, I need to make some earls. Oh, these seem very meritorious. They seem like good lads. Or he's being told, you're appointing my sons to these positions of power. So the Godwin family are kind of accruing power for themselves. What happens, and you can see it happen in the late 1040s, is Edward starts to push back by appointing his own kinsmen or his own friends to positions of power. And the thing that where it eventually the gloves come off is Edward's closest confidant, Robert of Jumièges, who is, as his title suggests, originally Abbot of Jumièges in Normandy, is first promoted in the 1040s to Bishop of London, which is a very powerful role. But when the old Archbishop of Canterbury dies in 1050, Edward the Confessor nominates him as his Archbishop of Canterbury against the Godwin candidate. And this really kind of puts the Godwin's nose out of joint.
Do you think that was a bad idea?
Well, I think, you might say, well, Edward could have had a much easier life if he'd just done as he was told. And that's, I think, that was the Godwin plan all along. So it's not a question of whether I think the Archbishop of Canterbury was a bad idea. Was it a bad idea to push back against Godwin? Well, Godwin wasn't going to go down without a fight.
Yeah.
The other thing is foreign policy as well, because Godwin is saying, we should, I forget which one it is, but we should back the King of Denmark, in his struggle against his neighbours.
Yeah.
And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says, Godwin is literally saying we should send Englishmen to fight. We should send a flotilla of ships.
Yeah.
And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says it seemed to everybody that this was a stupid scheme. It's a crazy idea.
Yeah.
And Edward backs the Godwin critics, the anti-Godwin faction, who by this stage is clearly identified with the Earls of Mercia. The Earl of Northumbria is kind of somewhere on the fence. But there is a growing anti-Godwin coalition developing that Edward is clearly favouring. And as we've said, it comes the gloves come off in 1051. The thing that is kind of debatable in all of this is there a larger question looming about the succession? Because despite having been married to Godwin's daughter Edith for half a dozen years now, there isn't the patter of little Godwin feet to be heard. And people are becoming anxious. Edward the Confessor is now nearly 50. And despite all the attributes, the attractiveness of Godwin's daughter that we've been told about, they haven't managed to produce a successor. So this is I think the root cause of all the anxiety is who's next.
Yeah. Which we will come back to, of course. There is a big falling out in 1051 when the Godwins actually get sent into exile.
Perhaps we should say in a few seconds just exactly what happens in 1051, 1052. So 1051, the Godwin and Edward fall out massively. We have a famous scene in the Life of King Edward where Edward says, "You can have peace with me when I get my brother back." And as soon as he hears these words, Godwin rushes down to Sussex to his manor at Bosham and flees into exile. And all his sons do. So some of his sons go to Ireland. Others go with him, with the Earl himself, to Flanders. And very significantly, Edward sends his queen, Godwin's daughter, Edith, to a nunnery. So she is literally, get thee to a nunnery, banished from the royal bedchamber. So it seems that, Edward has triumphed. But the thing is, with a faction, with a family as powerful as the Godwins, they are not going to take that exile lying down. And what they do in the coming months is, both in Ireland and in Flanders, they raise fleets and thousands of men and mount an invasion the following year, which puts them right back in the driving seat.
Yeah.
And all of the revolution of the previous year is undone. Not only are Godwin's sons reinstated to their earldoms, but Edith is reintroduced to the royal bedchamber, and so you can. I can't quite quote you chapter and verse on this, but you can sort of almost sense the humiliation that Edward must feel at this point. So it's a very short-lived revolution, and the counter-revolution is swift and comprehensive.
Yeah, and given that Edward had been happy to send Edith to a nunnery during that period, is there a sense that he had kind of given up on the idea of having an heir with Edith? Because what about this idea that he offered the throne to William in Normandy?
Well, yes, and you say given up on the idea. I mean, it's arguable. I think there's a very strong traditional argument that he'd never really entertained the idea of having a child with Edith. I mean, certainly the testimony of Edith herself, which we can say, well, she's bound to say that, isn't she? But she says, and she maintains in that Life of King Edward, that they had never slept together, that he had preserved the perfect chastity, of throughout their marriage. That sort of, it's an argument for his saintliness. But it's there right from the beginning. People used to say, oh, this is something that's introduced in later copyings of this text, but it was proved, at least 20 years ago, that those comments are there in the original draft. So her line certainly was, he never slept with me. And that would be a very good way to spite your father-in-law, who was expecting to have his grandsons on the throne sooner rather than later, if you don't have any kids. And, as soon as people say, well, perhaps they were just, the modern argument is, right, many couples are infertile, perhaps this is just bad luck. Well, as soon as he gets the opportunity, he sends her to a nunnery. And he makes no plans to remarry in that space of time. What he does do in the interval, the short, 8 or 9 months that the Godwins are out of the picture, is he invites over his cousin, who is now Duke William of Normandy, who enters the story at this point, major new character, who crosses the Channel. Our English sources ignore this entirely, apart from one line in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that says, this year Duke William, came over with some of his men, and the king received him and some of his men, and then sort of, let them go again. And it's really, it's one of those frustratingly terse telegraphic entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Like, you couldn't give us any more than that. But what was transacted there and what was said must have been some quid pro quo, because what Edward desperately needs at that point is military support. He knows the Godwins are planning a comeback, and he needs the support of a very powerful man, his kinsman on the other side of the Channel. This is the point where later Norman chroniclers would say that the prize that is dangled before William to keep him on board is the English throne, the succession.
Did that happen? Is that tenable? That was said.
I think that, as I'm very traditional when it comes to, I think that all the traditional elements of this picture lock together very well. So you have to keep consistently arguing the opposite and saying, well, Godwin murdered his brother, or contrived the murder of his brother, but they probably kissed and made up after that, and he probably did want to marry Edith, and they probably did try for kids, but they couldn't have them. And yes, William the Conqueror clearly came over, because that's in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That's irrefutable. But there's no reason to suppose that anything substantial was transacted. It's like, well, really, because this is quite a crucial moment. And if ever a king needed support, it's Edward the Confessor, in the winter of 1051, 1052. So I tend to think, Edward's childlessness is due to his resisting Edith's charms, and I do think that William was offered a major carrot in the winter of 1051 to 2. And then that's the reason I think there's a silence in the English sources, is because once the Godwins were back in power, everyone wanted to pretend this hadn't happened. So he didn't know what he was doing. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll go back to, we'll come up with a new plan. If you're not going to have any kids, okay, that's God wills it. But we'll come up with a new plan now. Which finally gets us to the 1050s, I think. Yeah,
finally. But quite a significant plot twist just there, which will inform the story as it progresses. Yeah. Now, before we finish this episode, there's one thing I think we need to talk about, which I alluded to at the start, is what is England? What do we mean by England at this point? Was this a unified nation of people who thought of themselves as English and were perfectly happy being ruled by kings who were ostensibly or obviously Southern English, or then Scandinavian?
I think the short answer is yes. In that, so people will know that in earlier centuries there have been what is now England have been a plurality of kingdoms. So I mean, famously, the big seven are Wessex, Essex and Sussex, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria. And that by the time you get to the early 9th century, that those have been reduced by a sort of knockout competition to 4. And then what happens in the course of the late 9th century is 3 of the big ones are knocked out by the Vikings. So Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia are removed. And from that point on, from the late 9th century, King Alfred the Great on, it's an existential struggle between the Kingdom of Wessex and the new Danish rulers/settlers to the north and east of Wessex. And what happens in the 10th century, and this is really where England is forged, is those English rulers, Alfred's successors, take land and power from the new Scandinavian rulers of eastern and northern England, to the point where you get to, certainly by the middle of the 10th century, that the kings of Wessex, as they were, are styling themselves Rex Anglorum, kings of the English. Now, you can argue about how effective their power was, north of, say, I don't know, the Mersey or the River Trent, but they are nominally and to some extent in reality, rulers of those lands. They have to delegate a lot of power in the north to their local representatives, and they are ruling over a region which has been substantially settled or seen a lot of Scandinavian settlement. But nonetheless, there's only one king in this kingdom, and he's styling himself as such, Rex Anglorum. And there's only one coin that runs throughout this kingdom. Famously, King Edgar reforms his coinage in the early 970s. And, this coin is the same, not only the same weight and the same fineness wherever it's struck, whether it's struck in Canterbury or York or wherever, but it also has the same design on it, exactly the same design. So not just the same legend, but it's using the same dies to strike these coins. So that's a good indication, the coinage, of just what a unified kingdom it is. And by the end of the century, by the end of the 10th century, the 980s, 990s, we have chroniclers referring in passing to sort of Anglia. So we have one chronicler writing in Latin who literally says Britain is now called England. It's called Anglia. That's what we call it. And Elfric Javensham as well, he's writing in Old English. He says, he doesn't sort of say it as explicitly, but he refers to Englalonda, England. So we have this new polity that's been forged in the 10th century, by the end of the 10th century, has a new name, England. And that really comes into common usage during the early 11th century when you've got Cnut on the throne. So yeah, I'd say England is not just an abstraction. It's got there's a real state, if you like, behind that. Not terribly powerful in the north, but certainly in the Midlands and the south. With its shires and sheriffs and boroughs, it is as close to being an organised state as you can imagine for an early 11th century polity.
Brilliant. So people up and down the land would have been quite interested, no doubt, in who was on the throne and who was likely to be on the throne as the 1050s and 1060s progressed.
Well, certainly. I mean, just to take an example, in the 1030s, when they're arguing about who gets to be king, it's not just people in Wessex arguing about it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle shows the earls and the thanes north of the Thames, we're told. So the Mercians and by implication the Northumbrians are coming to these great royal assemblies to make their voice heard about who should wear the crown.
Yep. Okay. Right. So let's finish there. We've got to kind of the mid-1050s. A lot's happened. Things are going to hot up big time in the next episode as we get up close and personal with the contenders to succeed King Edward, and we get closer to the momentous events of 1066.